What if I told you that Singapore has grown an entire forest 200 meters high in the sky, with over 100,000 trees living inside skyscrapers and on building facades, creating a three-dimensional jungle that has transformed one of the world's most densely populated cities? It sounds like science fiction, right? Well, Singapore has been quietly building exactly this for over a decade. And the result, after 10 years, has created the world's first truly three-dimensional green city. This is that incredible story of urban evolution. But to understand why Singapore would attempt to grow forests in the sky, we need to go back to 2010. That year, Singapore faced a crisis that threatened its future as a livable city. With just 720 square kilometers of land and a population of 5.4 million people, Singapore had become one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Every square meter of land was precious, and the competition between urban development and green space had reached a breaking point. Picture this. Singapore's population density was approaching 8,000 people per square kilometer, making it more crowded than Hong Kong or Manhattan. The island nation had already converted over 60% of its land to urban development, leaving just small patches of rainforest and carefully managed parks. Traditional urban planning suggested that continued development would require sacrificing even more green space, potentially turning Singapore into a concrete jungle with devastating consequences for livability and environmental health. The numbers surrounding Singapore's environmental challenges were absolutely staggering. The tropical city-state experienced average temperatures of 32 degrees C year-round, but the urban heat island effect was pushing temperatures in the city centre to over 40 degrees C during peak hours. Air conditioning costs were consuming nearly 60% of Singapore's total electricity consumption. Air quality was deteriorating due to regional haze and local traffic emissions. Most critically, Singapore was losing biodiversity at an alarming rate as native habitats were converted to urban development. But Singapore's government had an ambitious vision that defied conventional urban planning. Instead of choosing between development and nature, they would combine them in ways that had never been attempted before. The concept was called City in a Garden. Not just a garden city with scattered parks, but an urban environment where nature was integrated into every aspect of the built environment. The inspiration came from natural forest ecosystems, where vegetation grows in multiple vertical layers from ground-level shrubs to towering canopy trees. If forests could create complex three-dimensional ecosystems in nature, why couldn't cities do the same? Instead of limiting green space to horizontal parks and gardens, Singapore would grow forests vertically, on and inside buildings. The challenge seemed insurmountable. How do you grow trees 200 meters above the ground in tropical heat and wind? How do you provide enough water and nutrients to sustain large-scale vegetation in artificial environments? Most importantly, how do you create systems that could support not just individual plants, but entire ecosystems with the complexity and resilience of natural forests? Traditional green building technologies existed, but they were limited to small-scale applications like green roofs or simple wall gardens. What Singapore envisioned was something completely different: multi-story forests that could house thousands of trees and support diverse wildlife populations. These would not be decorative plants on buildings. They would be functioning ecosystems that provided the same environmental benefits as natural forests. The technical challenges were unlike anything attempted in urban planning. Trees growing at height face extreme conditions, including high winds, intense solar radiation, and limited root space. They require sophisticated irrigation systems, specialized growing media, and structural support systems that could handle the weight of mature trees. Most critically, they need maintenance access systems that allow for pruning, replacement, and ecosystem management at dangerous heights. Environmental scientists were initially skeptical of the project's feasibility. Dr. Peter Edwards from the National University of Singapore pointed out that tropical trees are adapted to forest conditions with filtered light, high humidity, and protection from wind. Growing them on building facades subjects them to conditions more like mountain peaks than rainforest floors. Many experts predicted that the stress of artificial growing conditions would result in high mortality rates and expensive maintenance requirements. Urban planners raised different concerns. The weight of soil, water, and mature trees would require significantly stronger building structures, increasing construction costs by an estimated 20 to 30%. The complexity of vertical forest systems could lead to maintenance nightmares and system failures that would be expensive and difficult to repair. Most critically, some worried that the focus on vertical greening would distract from more proven approaches like protecting existing natural areas. Local residents were divided on the project. Some embraced the vision of living and working in forest-like environments that could provide cooler temperatures and cleaner air. Others worried about increased costs, maintenance problems, and potential pest issues associated with bringing large amounts of vegetation into urban environments. Property developers were cautious about investing in unproven technologies that might require costly retrofits or replacements. International urban planning experts were equally uncertain. While green building technologies were gaining popularity worldwide, no city had attempted vertical forestation at the scale Singapore proposed. The closest precedents were projects like Milan's Bosco Verticale, which incorporated trees into 2 residential towers. But Singapore was planning to apply similar technologies across hundreds of buildings throughout the city. Insurance companies and financial institutions were particularly concerned about the risks. What would happen if irrigation systems failed during Singapore's frequent heavy rains? How would building facades handle the root systems of large trees over decades of growth? Would vertical forests create fire hazards or structural problems that could endanger building occupants? These questions had no precedents to provide answers. But Singapore's government had advantages that other cities lacked. As a city-state with centralized planning authority, Singapore could implement coordinated policies across the entire urban area. The country's wealth allowed for significant investment in experimental technologies. Most importantly, Singapore's tropical climate provided year-round growing conditions that could support diverse vegetation. The project, officially launched in 2014 as part of Singapore's Skyrise Greenery initiative, began with pilot installations on government buildings and public housing projects. The goal was ambitious: to add 200 hectares of vertical green space by 2030, equivalent to creating 280 soccer fields of forest growing on building walls and rooftops. But this wasn't just about quantity, it was about creating functional ecosystems that could provide the same benefits as natural forests. The vertical forests would need to support biodiversity, improve air quality, reduce urban temperatures, and create habitats for wildlife. Most ambitiously, they would need to be economically sustainable, providing enough benefits to justify their construction and maintenance costs. The first major installation was the Park Royal Collection Pickering Hotel, which incorporated over 15,000 square meters of green space across 16 floors. The building featured hanging gardens, sky terraces, and green walls that created a continuous forest environment from ground level to the top floors. The success of this pilot project provided the foundation for much larger and more ambitious vertical forest installations. Critics continued to question whether the technology could scale beyond showcase projects. Environmental groups worried that vertical forests might become greenwashing that allowed continued destruction of natural habitats while creating artificial substitutes. Economists pointed out that the high costs of vertical forestry could divert resources from more cost-effective environmental improvements. But Singapore's leadership was convinced that vertical forests represented the future of sustainable urban development. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong announced that Singapore would become the world's first forest city. An urban environment where nature and development were so thoroughly integrated that the distinction between built and natural environments would disappear. Construction of Singapore's first large-scale vertical forest began in earnest in 2015, with the development of the Capita Spring Tower, a 51-story skyscraper that would incorporate a 12-story vertical forest rising from the 17th to 29th floors. This wasn't just green decoration, it was a functioning forest ecosystem suspended 200 meters above the ground, complete with mature trees understory vegetation, and designed wildlife habitats. The engineering challenges were unprecedented. Each tree required its own specialized growing system, including custom soil mixtures, individual irrigation lines, and structural supports that could handle both the weight of mature plants and the dynamic loads from tropical winds. The growing medium alone required developing new soil compositions that could provide adequate nutrition while remaining light enough for high-rise construction. The irrigation system was a marvel of engineering precision. Over 10 kilometers of micro-irrigation tubing was embedded throughout the vertical forest, delivering precisely measured amounts of water and nutrients to each plant based on species requirements, growth stage, and environmental conditions. Moisture sensors throughout the system provided real-time data to automated control systems that could adjust watering schedules based on weather, humidity, and plant health indicators. But perhaps the most innovative aspect was the structural integration between the forest and the building itself. Rather than simply attaching plants to building surfaces, the architects and engineers designed the tower so that the forest and structure functioned as an integrated system. The trees provided cooling and air filtration for the building, while the building provided wind protection and structural support for the forest. The selection of plant species required expertise from botanists, ecologists, and horticulturists from around the world. The vertical forest needed to support a diverse ecosystem while surviving the extreme conditions of high-rise environments. Native Singapore species were prioritized, but adaptations were necessary to handle the unique stresses of vertical growth. Dr. Sean Lum from the Nanyang Technological University led the ecological design team that selected over 80 species of trees, shrubs, and ground cover plants. The selection process considered not just survival rates, but ecological functions including air purification, cooling effects, carbon sequestration, and habitat provision for wildlife. The goal was to create not just a collection of plants, but a functioning forest ecosystem. The first plantings began in 2017, and the results exceeded all expectations. Tree survival rates in the vertical forest reached 95%, far higher than the 70 to 80% that planners had considered acceptable. More remarkably, many plants actually grew faster in the vertical environment than they would have in ground-level conditions, apparently benefiting from the controlled irrigation, protection from ground-level pests, and optimized growing conditions. The success attracted international attention and investment. Vertical forest technology companies from around the world established operations in Singapore to participate in the growing market. The Singapore government provided grants and incentives for buildings that incorporated vertical forests, creating a powerful economic driver for adoption of the technology. By 2019, over 50 buildings across Singapore had incorporated significant vertical forest installations, ranging from small green walls to multi-story forest ecosystems. The total tree population in Singapore's vertical forests had reached 30,000 trees, with an additional 200,000 smaller plants and shrubs. The city was literally growing upward as well as outward. The environmental impacts became apparent almost immediately. Temperature monitoring showed that areas with significant vertical forest coverage experienced 3 to 5 degrees C lower temperatures than similar areas without vertical greening. Air quality measurements detected significant improvements in particulate matter and nitrogen oxide levels. Most remarkably, the vertical forests were beginning to support wildlife populations, including birds, butterflies, and small mammals that had established permanent habitats in the sky-high ecosystems. But the real breakthrough came with the completion of the 100,000 tree milestone in 2020. The super tree grove at Gardens by the Bay was expanded with additional vertical forest installations that brought Singapore's total vertical tree population to exactly 100,000 trees. This represented the largest collection of trees growing above ground level anywhere in the world. The economic benefits began to match the environmental improvements. Buildings with vertical forests reported 20–30% reductions in air conditioning costs due to the cooling effects of transpiration and shading. Property values for buildings with significant green features increased by an average of 15%. Most importantly, the vertical forests were beginning to pay for themselves through energy savings and increased property values. International recognition followed quickly. Singapore was named the world's greenest city by multiple organizations, surpassing traditional leaders like Copenhagen and Vancouver. The United Nations Human Settlements Programme designated Singapore as a model for sustainable urban development, specifically citing the vertical forest program as an innovation that other cities should adopt. The success sparked a global movement in vertical forestry. Cities around the world began developing their own vertical forest programs, often with technical assistance from Singapore-based companies and consultants. Milan, which had pioneered small-scale vertical forests, announced plans to incorporate 3 million new plants into buildings across the city. China launched a massive vertical greening program across its major cities, aiming to add 40 million trees to urban environments by 2030. Corporate adoption accelerated as businesses recognized both the environmental and marketing benefits of vertical forests. Tech companies were particularly early adopters, with Google, Facebook, and Microsoft incorporating extensive vertical forests into their Singapore offices. The presence of vertical forests became a selling point for attracting international companies and top talent to Singapore. The technology continued to evolve rapidly. Smart irrigation systems incorporated artificial intelligence to optimize watering schedules and detect plant health problems before they became visible. Automated maintenance systems reduced the need for human access to dangerous heights. Most innovatively, some vertical forests began incorporating food production, growing fruits and vegetables alongside ornamental and native plants. Research institutions around the world began studying Singapore's vertical forests to understand their ecological and environmental impacts. Studies confirmed that vertical forests provided most of the same ecosystem services as ground-level forests, including air purification, carbon sequestration, temperature regulation, and biodiversity support. Some benefits were actually enhanced in vertical environments, particularly air filtration in urban areas with heavy pollution. The wildlife impacts were perhaps the most surprising discovery. By 2021, researchers had documented over 200 species of animals living in Singapore's vertical forests, including 85 bird species, 60 butterfly species, and numerous small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Some species had established permanent breeding populations in the sky-high habitats, creating urban wildlife communities that existed entirely above ground level. The success also created new industries and job opportunities. Vertical forest design, installation, and maintenance became specialized fields requiring unique combinations of botanical, engineering, and construction expertise. Singapore developed educational programs to train the workforce needed to support a vertical forest economy, creating new career paths in the growing green technology sector. By 2022, Singapore's vertical forests contained over 150,000 trees and 500,000 smaller plants, distributed across more than 200 buildings throughout the city. The total green space provided by vertical forests exceeded 300 hectares, equivalent to adding 420 soccer fields of forest to the urban environment without using any additional land area. The economic transformation was equally impressive. The vertical forest industry in Singapore generated over $500 million annually in direct economic activity, including design, construction, maintenance, and research. The energy savings from cooling effects exceeded $200 million per year, making the vertical forests economically beneficial, even without considering environmental and health benefits. International consulting and technology export became major revenue sources, as Singapore-based companies shared their expertise with cities worldwide. Singapore's vertical forest technologies were being implemented in over 30 countries, creating a global industry centered on expertise developed in the city-state. But perhaps the most significant impact was the transformation of urban planning philosophy. Singapore had proven that cities could grow vertically in multiple dimensions simultaneously, adding both building space and natural ecosystems in integrated systems. This challenged fundamental assumptions about the trade-offs between development and environmental protection. What happened over the following years transformed not just Singapore, but the entire global understanding of what cities could become. By 2024, Singapore's vertical forests had grown to encompass over 200,000 trees and 1 million plants distributed across 500 buildings, creating a three-dimensional forest ecosystem that extended from street level to 300 meters above the ground. But the numbers tell only part of an extraordinary story of urban evolution and environmental regeneration. The most remarkable development was the emergence of what ecologists termed vertical ecosystems, complex biological communities that functioned independently in the sky. These weren't just collections of plants on buildings, but integrated ecosystems with their own predator-prey relationships, pollination networks, and nutrient cycles. Research conducted by the National University of Singapore documented food webs involving over 300 species of animals that lived their entire life cycles in the vertical forests. Dr. Li Wei, who became Singapore's chief vertical forest scientist in 2023, described the phenomenon as the birth of three-dimensional nature. The vertical forests had developed their own microclimates, with humidity levels 20 to 30% higher than the surrounding urban environment and temperatures that varied by floor level, creating diverse habitat niches that supported different species communities. Perhaps most astonishingly, the vertical forests had begun reproducing themselves. Seeds from trees in sky-high gardens were naturally dispersed by wind and birds to establish new plant communities on buildings throughout the city. Singapore was experiencing spontaneous vertical reforestation as nature adapted to the three-dimensional growing opportunities that the city provided. The environmental transformation was visible from space. Satellite imagery showed Singapore as a distinctly green city, with forest coverage that extended vertically through the urban canopy. NASA studies confirmed that Singapore's vertical forests were producing measurable impacts on regional climate, reducing the urban heat island effect, not just locally, but across the broader metropolitan area. Air quality improvements exceeded all projections. Singapore, which had struggled with haze from regional forest fires and local pollution, achieved World Health Organization air quality standards for the first time in decades. The vertical forests were filtering an estimated 48 tons of air pollutants annually, equivalent to removing 30,000 cars from the roads. Respiratory health statistics showed significant improvements, particularly for children and elderly residents. The cooling effects had transformed Singapore's energy landscape. Citywide electricity consumption for air conditioning had decreased by 25%, despite population growth and increased building construction. The energy savings exceeded $800 million annually, making the vertical forest program one of the most cost-effective climate adaptation investments ever implemented. But the most profound impact was on urban psychology and quality of life. Studies by the Singapore University of Technology and Design found that residents living and working in buildings with vertical forests reported significantly higher life satisfaction, lower stress levels, and improved mental health compared to those in conventional buildings. The presence of nature at every floor level had created urban environments that felt more like forest retreats than concrete cities. Property values reflected these quality of life improvements. Buildings with extensive vertical forests commanded 30–50% premium prices compared to conventional structures. More importantly, Singapore had virtually eliminated the traditional trade-off between urban density and environmental quality. The city could continue growing vertically while simultaneously increasing rather than decreasing its natural environment. Wildlife populations had exploded in ways that amazed even the most optimistic ecologists. The vertical forests supported over 400 species of birds, making Singapore one of the most bird-diverse cities in the world, despite its small size and high density. Butterfly populations had increased tenfold, with some species establishing breeding colonies on specific floors of skyscrapers based on the microclimate conditions they preferred. The most remarkable wildlife success was the establishment of primate populations in the vertical forests. Long-tailed macaques, which had been largely displaced from Singapore by urban development, began establishing territories in vertical forest environments. By 2024, over 200 primates were living permanently in sky-high habitats, creating one of the world's only urban primate populations that existed entirely above ground level. International adoption of Singapore's vertical forest technologies had created a global transformation in urban planning. Over 100 cities worldwide had implemented Singapore-designed vertical forest systems, creating a planetary network of three-dimensional green cities. The total global population of trees in vertical forests exceeded 5 million, making urban forestry one of the fastest-growing conservation strategies worldwide. China's adoption was particularly dramatic. Following Singapore's model, Chinese cities had planted over 2 million trees in vertical forests across 50 cities. Beijing alone added 100,000 trees to building facades and rooftops, contributing significantly to the city's air quality improvements. The Chinese government announced plans to require vertical forest installations on all new buildings over 50 meters tall in major cities. European cities had embraced the technology with equal enthusiasm. Paris incorporated vertical forests into its Olympic venues and major transportation hubs. London launched a program to add 500,000 trees to building surfaces by 2030. Even cold climate cities like Stockholm and Helsinki developed adapted vertical forest technologies using cold-hardy species and protected growing environments. The economic impacts had created an entirely new global industry. Vertical forest design and installation generated over $10 billion annually worldwide, with Singapore-based companies holding dominant market positions in consulting, technology, and specialized growing systems. The city-state had become the center of a global green technology cluster that attracted investment and talent from around the world. Educational and research impacts were equally significant. Singapore's universities had become global centers of excellence for vertical forest research, attracting graduate students and researchers from around the world. The accumulated knowledge from 10 years of large-scale vertical forest operations was being codified into new academic disciplines and professional certification programs. The technology continued to evolve in sophisticated directions. Fourth-generation vertical forest systems incorporated automated maintenance robots that could prune, water, and monitor plant health without human intervention. Integrated food production systems allowed buildings to grow significant portions of their occupants' fresh produce in vertical gardens. Some experimental installations incorporated renewable energy generation through photosynthetic energy capture systems. Climate change adaptation became a major focus as global temperatures continued to rise. Singapore's vertical forests were proving to be highly effective climate-resilient strategies, providing cooling, floodwater absorption, and air quality improvements that helped cities adapt to changing environmental conditions. The IPCC included vertical forestry as a recommended climate adaptation strategy for urban areas in its 2024 report. Urban planning philosophy had fundamentally shifted because of Singapore's success. The traditional concept of cities as artificial environments that displaced nature had been replaced by models of integrated ecosystems, where built and natural environments functioned as unified systems. Architecture schools worldwide began teaching vertical forest design as a standard component of sustainable building design. The social and cultural impacts extended far beyond environmental benefits. Singapore's vertical forests had created new forms of urban community, with buildings functioning as vertical villages where residents shared responsibility for maintaining their local ecosystems. Children growing up in Singapore developed relationships with nature that were impossible in conventional urban environments, creating a generation that understood cities as natural habitats rather than artificial spaces. The success had also challenged economic assumptions about environmental protection. Rather than requiring trade-offs between economic growth and environmental quality, Singapore had demonstrated that environmental improvements could drive economic development. The vertical forest industry had created thousands of jobs while simultaneously improving air quality, reducing energy costs, and increasing property values. By 2024, Singapore's transformation was complete. The city that had once faced a choice between development and nature had eliminated that choice entirely. With over 200,000 trees growing in the sky and 1 million plants integrated into urban infrastructure, Singapore had become the world's first three-dimensional forest city. The results proved that human creativity and determination could reimagine the relationship between cities and nature. The global implications were profound. If Singapore could grow a forest in the sky while maintaining its position as a leading financial and technological center, then every city could potentially achieve similar integration of nature and development. The vertical forests of Singapore had proven that the future of urban development lay not in choosing between built and natural environments, but in creating new forms of urban ecosystems that enhanced both human prosperity and environmental health. The lesson of Singapore's vertical forests extends far beyond urban planning. It demonstrates that the most intractable problems often require solutions that transcend traditional categories and assumptions. By refusing to accept the conventional wisdom that cities must displace nature, Singapore created new possibilities for human settlement that could support both economic development and environmental restoration. As millions of trees continue to grow skyward in cities around the world, they carry with them the promise that human ingenuity can create urban environments that are not just sustainable, but regenerative. Singapore's forest in the sky represents a new chapter in the relationship between human civilization and the natural world, one where cities become catalysts for environmental recovery rather than causes of environmental destruction.